Hi guys, welcome. This is Janice Temple with World Black History on Periscope, and we are here at the Journal-isms Roundtable holiday party here at the museum in Washington, D.C. And so I'm going to go around and interview some people. I think, you know what? I'm going to talk to Incognito. Hi, how are you doing, Luis Gonzalez? So, you're the salsa champion of okay, and what are your names again?
Sarah Joy Boyd.
Sarah Joy Boyd.
Daryl Boyd.
And Daryl Boyd.
Yes.
And you're salsa champion.
That's right. Current Salsa Summit small team, world champions.
Awesome. And where were they held?
Miami.
Yeah, in Miami. So it's actually coming up again in January. We're gonna go and try to get it again.
Fantastic. That's wonderful.
She's actually also competing this time as a soloist.
Oh, really?
So my solo for the first time. Praise the Lord for it and see if we can do well.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, good luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I love salsa, so you guys need to have a salsa party here.
Most definitely. Put the music on. I can't help but dance.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I interview you on Periscope?
Yes. Oh my gosh. I've never been on.
You have?
Oh yeah, I'm used to it.
Oh, fantastic. Let me change it. There we go. That's
Now all the world knows where I am now. All of my students use Periscope.
Okay, and your name is?
Dwight Ellis.
Dwight Ellis.
Yeah, I'm a professor at Bowie State University.
Okay, and what do you teach?
I teach communications,
Of course.
like media law and
Okay.
media ethics,
Okay.
you know. And so I try to make my students as smart as I possibly can.
Yes.
It's a charge, making them believe in the virtues of reading and writing and history and all that stuff.
Okay, wonderful,
But I love
wonderful. Fantastic, glad to hear it. Hi, oh, that's a long one. Marseille, they're from France. That's all I
Okay,
say.
oh
They're
wow,
French.
why not?
So thank you so much. May we? Okay.
Great meeting you too. I heard a lot about you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Oh, let's see if I can get around over here. Okay.
The capability to get into anybody. Not one document from Trump.
Yeah, if you would only hacking. I'm trying to get to interview some people.
You're next. You're next.
Can I get you over here on Periscope?
She's asking questions.
Yes. So tell everybody on Periscope what your name is.
I'm Barbara Reynolds.
Barbara Reynolds. And you wrote?
I've just finished the memoirs of Coretta Scott King. It's called My Life, My Love, and My Legacy. And she was more than a label. She was more than the wife of, the widow of. She was a hero, a leader in her own right. She was courageous. Her home was bombed in 1955 in Montgomery. And at that time, she had her baby. And her father, Dr. And Dr. King came and tried to get her leave, but she said she would not leave her husband. She was married to him, but also married to the movement. So there's so much. She was courageous. She raised 4 children. She made this movement around King so that we have the holiday meal. But she was a columnist. She taught nonviolence to thousands of people. And so you'll see her as she wanted to be seen, not as others saw her.
Okay.
So I'm glad about Periscope. I want to learn how to do it myself.
All right.
Thank you for doing it.
Oh, thank you.
I'll give you a card so you can keep,
Okay. Okay.
All right, now you've seen these books on the table here from Dr. Mann.
Thank you.
He enthralled us at one of our roundtables earlier this year when he talked about ISIS in great detail based on all this counter-intelligence work. And now we've got Thriller, and you'll see the plot to Hack America, fresh from the headlines about Putin and hacked computers in the United States. So
Cameras go down, guys.
that's what we're talking about.
Yes. Oh, okay.
It's very short since we only have about 25 minutes and there's another speaker. So I was asked to read something tonight, and the funny thing is I gave away all the books. So I borrowed one. But people ask me, how did I get this book out so fast, The Plot to Hack America? I started this book, or the concept of this book came out in April after I heard that the DNC was hacked. And in between that time, I had been writing a book, my 6th book called Hacking ISIS, which was an intelligence analysis of ISIS's cyber warfare operations around the world, which they are doing, and how we've been using them to kill them. It's awesome. But you wouldn't know it from watching the television, right? Because they keep telling us that the war is a failure. ISIS won't exist in another 6 months to a year. So it's going to be very interesting because I have to get my book out before they collapse. That's that's okay. He read my book. The round table saw it first. Okay. But in the middle of that book, we found that there were 2 cyber operations that were carried out in the name of ISIS against French television, TV France 5, and against the German Bundestag, right, German parliament, that were branded ISIS. They left flags all over the place. It was really awesome. Looked like ISIS had really good cyber capability. Turns out it was Russian intelligence. And the fingerprints of these malware packages that they leave are very well known. Because, you know, when you leave a piece of software, if NSA writes that piece of software, it's going to be big, expensive, and sexy, right? If some kid down the street does it, it's going to look really awful. These malware packages, which is how they got into these computers, were very advanced, like, you know, $100 million software advanced. They were called ATP 28 and ATP 29, Advanced Persistent Threat 28 and 29, also known as Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear. Now, the reason you should remember those names is, while we were writing this book, somebody said, hey, you know, the DNC got hacked. And within 2 weeks, they said they had determined it was Cozy Bear, and that Fancy Bear, another component which came from Russian military intelligence, had been in their servers for over a year, stealing everything, copying all of their emails, voicemails, chats, everything. Russian intelligence had set themselves up in the Democratic National Committee for a very long time. But the very specific file that they went in to get, the Russian FSB, their old KGB, went to get, was the opposition folder on Donald Trump. And there was a worker there by the name of Alexandra Chalupa. She noticed first that her Yahoo account was being hit by foreign actors 20 to 30 times a day. And she was getting warnings from Yahoo, you are being attacked by a foreign actor. And then, when she went to work, their folders ended up missing. They were turned over to Gawker Media, to a guy by the name of Sam Biddle, who writes for The Intercept now. And the key of that is, it's the old Karl Rove school of, business. Get out things that are bad first. All of that was released. Then within a month, an entity pops up called Future for 2.0 who claims he was a Romanian hacker, but took a couple of weeks. It was pretty clear that he was a Russian intelligence asset that was pretending to be a Romanian hacker, and that the electronic fingerprints from the hack were the same electronic fingerprints that had hacked 3 Ukrainian power plants in 2015 and shut down power for 100,000 people. Literally took control of 3 power plants. And the operator on the power plant said, the only person who could do this is another person that operates these Russian-made power plants. And they just shut them down, went through the proper shutdown procedure. They hacked TV France, they hacked the BBC, they hacked the German parliament, they hacked many other governments, including the Ukraine, Georgia, Estonia, Latvia. All of them had the exact same electronic fingerprints of the DNC hack. And then, it's not worth doing an intelligence operation if you just keep the information and put it in a safe drawer. You want to use it to hurt people. And the information was passed on to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks, without any editing, just passed that information on to the public on very specific, highly timed releases. The first one was the first day of the Democratic Convention. That was designed to split the Democratic Party in half and to sow distrust amongst the Bernie Sanders supporters from the Hillary Clinton supporters, and it was successful. And then everything else that's come out since that time was done for the benefit of you, the news media. Suckers. They knew you couldn't stand not seeing information that was released about emails. And so they provided you with those emails. Interestingly enough, 2 days ago, PolitiFact put out an analysis that said the Russian hacks in the releases of the emails about Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Committee and John Podesta had no significant impact on this election. As an intelligence professional, I laugh. This is what we call a scripted intelligence operation. You don't go into someone's computers a year in advance for fun. You go in because you have an objective. And if you read the book, you'll understand that the Russians had a preferred candidate. And their candidate had been groomed since 2012 to love the Russian oligarchy, the rich people in Russia. When Donald Trump went to the Miss Universe pageant in 2012, he met real billionaires, people with $100, $200 billion in cash. And those people clearly gave him some talking points that he has adopted personally, like the destruction of NATO, allowing Russia to have all of its strategic objectives in Eastern Europe with no American interference, turning over Syria and Russia to the Assad regime, and of course, dismantling the European Union. In other words, everything that was built since World War II for American security and the mainstays of national security in the United States, Donald Trump adopted Russia's position on it and has won an election advocating that. Interesting component of it. I want to read you just one small bit. You took my page marker out, didn't you?
No, I didn't
God,
take
now you're
the page
looking up
marker
again.
out.
I go over all of the places where we call them the cyber bears, where these cyber bears had done hacks with the exact same electronic footprints and fingerprints as the DNC hack. Oh, by the way, they didn't just hack the DNC. They hacked the DCCC, Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. The DSCC shares its servers with the DCCC. And an interesting component of that is they put up a false web page to where they took not only your passwords, but all of the donations that were being made to the DCCC and DSCC for a period of time. They were stealing the money from the Democratic Party. They attempted a major hack on the Hillary Clinton campaign, and because she had secure email server in her house, they couldn't get to it directly, so they went to all of her aides around her, like John Podesta, and hacked their Gmail accounts. The only Republicans who got hacked this year were John McCain, who is an adamant enemy of Russia, Lindsey Graham, who is an adamant enemy of Russia and wants to arm the Ukraine, and Colin Powell. They released his information just before he was going to endorse her. Just enough information to damage Colin Powell in this election. He did not endorse Hillary Clinton. So this is now an operation, if I had been involved in it when I worked at my time at NSA, would have taken hundreds of intelligence professionals, a hacking team of dozens. You would have had to have a propaganda team measuring out what's being said by one political party. You would have to have had what we call an IWMC, an Information Warfare Management Cell, which would have to fuse all of this information together. And you would have to have people who are very savvy in the American political process from their foreign ministry, watching out for the events. And we saw very specific time releases. Donald Trump gave one speech on Pennsylvania, the speech where he claimed if he loses Pennsylvania, it's stolen. Within 4 days, they released every DNC document related to the state of Pennsylvania and their election operations there. 2 days later, he gave a speech on Florida. Within 1 day, they released specifically in one giant package every document related to the state of Florida. So they ramped up their response times from 96 hours to 24 hours over a period of 3 weeks. That is an intelligence operation. It cannot be done by amateurs. It requires an enormous amount of people. The fact is, Russia does this every day. If you might have heard yesterday, there was a massive release of German documents related to German government's liaisons with the National Security Agency. That's because the German elections are coming up next spring, and they hope to knock down Angela Merkel in favor of a far-right, leaning, anti-immigrant neo-Nazi party. And it's happening all over the world. This has a name. It's called Kompromat. And the Russians use this. They have used this back before the time of the czars. It is a very old school operation. But in the United States, what it literally was Watergate 2.0. You might recall Watergate was a break into the DNC headquarters in order to tap the phones and steal documents. This time, they did it without people, once we found out it was too late, and they knew the American media was so pliable that they just released documents even when they were found.
Forrest Gump wasn't around.
So it does have an impact. It is going to have a horrible, terribly lethal impact upon the United States. Because as a counterterrorism professional, I know what's going to happen in the next 4 years.
So
What, you want to know? I'll tell you one thing. ISIS, even though ISIS is in its last throes, if policy keeps continuing the way that the transition team has been talking, ISIS will be saved next year. If within the first 4 days, someone in the Trump campaign announced that the American embassy would be moving in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Within 1 hour, the Saudis, using their former chief of intelligence, Sheikh al-Tamimi, or Prince al-Tamimi, came out and said, if you do that, we will remove all 50 Arab ambassadors from the United States in every capacity. 50 out of this country, which means a formal diplomatic break with the entire Middle East. And at that point, the Muslim world will think, well, obviously America has lost its mind, and maybe ISIS and Al-Qaeda are right. But at least 100,000 of the young men throughout the Muslim world will think that. And that organization will start flooding back in with people. That's the least of what could happen. All right? And that's a straight intelligence assessment. That is not me just making things up. All right? I have the entire global community of people who are worried about what's going to happen. But that's just the Middle East. I don't even want to talk about Asia. What happens if North Korea detonates a nuke? Right? Viable nuke. Well, maybe it's the time that they think it's time to invade South Korea. Right? You have an unstable president. You have an administration that seems to operate on the basis of irrationality and bigotry. And they hate all of you, every one of you, from what I can tell. The news media. What's that?
Journalists and blacks?
Oh, what? There's blacks in here? We're at the museum. It's collective. That's 2 strikes. So,
You know, banning reporters are bipartisan and
yeah, no, not this way. All right, it's time to go back and read those books by Hannah Arendt about the rise of Nazism. Now, the funny thing is, people always ask me, they're like, Malcolm, these are pretty reactionary things. I'm the calmest guy on MSNBC, because terrorism's bad. I know that. I know what they're doing. But as a former intelligence officer, I know a trend when I see one. And the worst part is, this book was written and published 9 weeks before the election. It was written 5 months before the election. I have a bad history of predicting the future, which is what they paid me for most of my career. And it was all validated by the President of the United States and 17 intelligence agencies. Every word in this book. The only question is, what are we going to do about it now? Because suddenly this week, weeks after the election, I've gotten more interest in the Russian hacking than I did the entire 3 months before the election, when the book was coming out. So you may have already seen democracy fractured. I can tell you for a fact, the 17 U.S. intelligence agencies believe that a foreign intelligence agency, 2 of them, right, the FSB and the GRU, right, using Russia's version of NSA, has already affected the American electoral process. Done and done. Question is, how are we going to move forward from here? So I'm going to read you one line from this book, because why should I read you a lot when you guys can read it yourself? Anybody who has a copy of the book, you're required to go on Amazon.com and leave a 5-star review. Because I've got a lot of crazies out there leaving 1-star reviews because you can't talk bad about the Fuhrer. Don't laugh. That's not funny. People ask me, they say, well, Malcolm, can't you be objective? If this was the elections in Burundi, I would say you have a wonky technocrat has lost to a madman. And that would be a full top secret SCI code word assessment of that election. All right? Facts are facts, people. And unfortunately, since the current president-elect doesn't seem to care about intelligence briefings, we won't have to worry about it. Or facts. So I want to read a small piece out of here. People say, Malcolm, what's the most significant thing you found out when writing this book? Yes. Well, I wrote a whole chapter in here about how Vladimir Putin recruited Donald Trump. As I don't believe that he is a Russian intelligence asset, the way Mike Morrell put it, even an unwitting agent.
Manchurian candidate?
Well, it's like the Manchurian candidate running on the platform as the Manchurian candidate. That's what Trevor Noah said, and it's very accurate. So there's an entire section in here. We have an acronym called MICE. Yeah. Okay, I got one sentence here. When I read it to you, you're all going to go, oh my God. Because this is the oh my God section of the book. And it's how Russia recruits. There was a guy by the name of Yuri Bezmenov. He's a former intelligence officer in the KGB. And he said the KGB targets a very specific personality when they are recruiting assets. And when I read this specific personality, you're going to not like it. So if you just bear with me for 1 second and we'll move on to our next speaker, because someone removed the card out of the book and marked my place. I think here's we are.
It's a setup.
Yeah, it's a setup. She works for somebody.
You're myself.
Yeah. I have it right there. So one last thing while I'm finding this. I'm a board member of the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C. So if you guys want to learn more about this in great detail, just go over to the Spy Museum, and that's where you'll find it. See what you did? You screwed me up. Anyway, I will paraphrase what was said. Yuri Bezmenov was a KGB officer who defected in the 80s, came out, his videos were classified forever. Now they're out on YouTube. He says that the KGB recruits one specific personality, right? Egocentric people who have a lack of self-awareness all right? An unmanageable ego and insatiable greed. That's paraphrasing it. If you look in the book, you'll get the exact quote in there. And this is probably how we got to where we are today. Donald Trump is not a Russian agent. He is not a traitor. He hasn't broken any laws yet. He is what we call in the intelligence community an unwitting asset, which is someone who has been manipulated so much he doesn't even know he's been manipulated. He has 1,000 dirty, invisible strings on him. Certainly in his cabinet, half the people who were his advisors were 1 degree away from Russian intelligence on many levels. But after he asked the Russians to come and hack Hillary Clinton's emails, he may have become aware that he was actually an asset and enjoyed the role. I don't know. All I would say is that we need a counterintelligence investigation to find out whether that's true or not. So, thank you for inviting me. Next.
Coming to the after party, so.
No, I'm not.
Hi, this is Janice Temple. We're at the Journal-isms Roundtable at the museum. And
Now, time left, like I did for Wes to talk about his new book. Wes was last talk before us when he and the Washington Post team came in here talking about their project on police violence, who's being affected, not being affected, and uncovers the facts that eventually led to a Pulitzer Prize for the Washington Post team. And so now this is all part of this new book, which Wes will now tell us about. The title, give us the full title.
They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement.
There you go.
So,
Okay.
Uplifting stuff compared to ISIS and...
Go. Some hope.
So I'll be relatively brief, in part because I'm battling losing my voice after my book came out just a few weeks ago, and so I've been kind of all over the place. Flew back in from LA yesterday. But the book project came about after about 2.5 years of me being one of the Post's reporters covering the growing protest movement as well as the idea of police violence nationally. At the time of Michael Brown's death in Ferguson, I was a national political reporter for us. I covered Congress. And in fact, I had just gotten back that morning on a red-eye flight from Michigan, where I'd been covering a Senate primary race. And we heard there had been some unrest, some violence in Ferguson, Missouri over the weekend. A gas station had been burned down after a police shooting. And so I walked over to one of our lead national reporters, and we were just kind of talking it out. And I said, let me call some Hill sources. Let me see, maybe Claire McCaskill's office will know something. Maybe Lacey Clay's office or will be calling for an investigation. Let's see if there's a DC angle to this. And as we're having this conversation, our, at the time, Deputy National Editor came over and said, actually, could you get on a plane? Let's send somebody, let's go. Which, this was kind of story that at the time was kind of a jump ball, whether the Post would get on a plane and go cover this or not. So I grabbed the bag that I had brought with me from Michigan and got on the next plane to St. Louis, thinking I'd be there for about 3 days. We'd drop in, cover the Brown Family Press Conference, and then pick up some color for a cool weekend piece, something featurey and some heady. And I ended up spending, give or take, about 3 months in Ferguson, Missouri. One of the things that I write about this in the book a little bit, but I remember months later, so that's in August, and we kind of know what happens from there on. There's massive demonstrations, massive protests, dozens or thousands of people, demonstrators who were taken into custody and arrested at various points. Dozens of journalists, myself included, are arrested at some point covering the unrest. And then ultimately in November, the result that at the time felt like a bit of a surprise or we didn't know what was going to happen, but we now know that should not have been particularly surprising. The officer was not charged in the shooting. Not long after, I stayed in the Post. At this point, we had committed to this story. We had at one point opened a bureau. We had 6 people there. We were all working at a hotel conference room. We wanted to own this story. And eventually to own the story of race and police in this moment, in the end of the Obama years. And so because of that, and because of me being the one in the bureau without a wife or any children, I got to be the one who stayed for several weeks after the non-indictment to watch Ferguson rebuild. So I spent my Thanksgiving writing a story in a hotel room. But I finally, in early December, got to return to DC. And I remember, just being exhausted, immediately falling asleep on this airplane, with music looping in my headphones, and we landed into DCA. So I'm waking up as we have that scenic view coming in past the Washington, and my phone starts vibrating as we get back into reception. And that was the day that the grand jury in New York had decided not to indict the officer in Eric Brown's death, or Eric Gardner's death. I'm sorry. And so I get in the cab, go into the office, the old office on 15th and 15th. And start reporting on the now massive demonstrations in New York. After a few hours, I walked into my boss's office and said, all right, what do you want us to do next? You want me to get on a train up to New York? And they said, no, forget that. Go to Cleveland. There was that case of that kid who got killed. And so I got on an airplane and went to report on Tamir Rice's death. Now, Cleveland is home for me. It's where I grew up. It's where I'm from. I'd been in that park previously. And in fact, I'd gotten a text message from one of my best friends in high school back home in Cleveland while I was in Ferguson waiting for the grand jury. Hey, they killed a kid in a park. You got to come back to Cleveland and report on this. And at the time, I was so in the moment in Ferguson that I hadn't even, thanks man, I appreciate it, I hadn't even registered. And so then I went home after covering this story elsewhere. I went back to my surroundings to cover this type of story. And I remember sitting in my living room with my parents, because this book project is not just tries not to just be a rehashing of these stories we have heard and have seen already. We know what happened at Ferguson, we know what happened in Baltimore. But it tries to interweave various narratives. One, the story of these shootings, but two, the story of the young activists who have thrust themselves into the front lines of this conversation. And three, the story of myself and some other young journalists who were charged with covering these stories. It was what happened, or I thought was a one-off assignment, turned into an all-consuming beat, where it seemed every day there was a new hashtag, a new video, a new demonstration, a new city to be flying to, and how both lessons were learned over time while doing that, and also what the toll of that was. And so I remember flying back to Cleveland and sitting down in my parents' living room, my childhood home, and after all of these things had happened, we'd been covering this massive 3-month story, had been arrested, and I remember my parents sitting down and saying, so tell us about Ferguson, what is this place? We still don't really understand what this place was. And I think that was the impetus of writing this book for me, was that for so many people who weren't physically in these places, we watched the coverage on television, perhaps read the coverage in newspapers, and even for my parents who read hundreds of articles bylined by their son from this place, they still had a basic misunderstanding or lack of understanding of what this place was and what this really meant. The second thing is I would still get weekly, daily emails from readers, from regular readers, some subscribers, and a few of my special friends who like to email me every day about whatever thing I have got on. But I would still get these emails with people asking me, I still don't get it. Why is everyone so upset? Why are people in the streets? What's going on now? These are primarily our lovely white subscribers who we love and we appreciate their money. But they would write in and they would ask. They'd say, what's the point of this? I don't get this. I don't understand why people are so upset. Why won't people just let the system play out? Why won't they? And I found that, and I still find that increasingly frustrating. I felt like we'd done profiles of these families, we'd done profiles of these activists, we tried to write about this in a 10,000, 100,000 foot scope. Why don't people get this? Now, part of it is because we know why some people don't get this. But a second part of it was that I found myself telling these readers very often, in email and on the phone, not to start by trying to understand the crowd, not to start to try to understand the 100,000, but can you understand one person? Can I tell you the story of one of these young people who went from being a resident of this town to being a Twitter famous activist who's now meeting with President Obama in the White House? And can I tell you their story not just as a talking head on television, not just as a soundbite, but can I give you a 3-dimensional view of who they are, what their life has been like up until this point? can I explain to you how this woman from Ferguson, who is now one of the most prominent activists from Ferguson, was out not just for Michael Brown, but for her best friend Stefan, who was the last person killed by the St. Louis police before Michael Brown. Her media criticism so sharp because she remembers these only partially accurate headlines about her friend, and now she's seeing them elsewhere. Right? Can I tell you the story of the educator in Baltimore who becomes one of the faces of this protest movement, who grew up in a family with two addicts as parents, who clung to education as a means of getting out of this environment that he had been dealt, and then went into education for other young black and brown people like him, and who had this moment of realization as he sat hundreds of miles away from Ferguson that it doesn't really matter if I get these kids a good math teacher or science teacher if they're dead in the streets. And so what I attempt to do in this book by painting these vignettes is trying to show how someone goes from being that educator, goes from being that college student, goes from being Bree Newsom, the activist who at one point canvassed for Barack Obama, was heavily involved within the system. How does she go from canvassing for Barack Obama to climbing the flagpole in South Carolina and taking the Confederate flag down? What is the political evolution, and what does that say about the moment we have been in during the second half of the Obama presidency? The other thing I attempted to do in this book, which was difficult because other than on my Twitter feed, I'm not particularly used to writing about myself in any capacity, right? I'm a newspaper reporter. But one thing I tried to do in this book was try to walk through some of the crises of being someone constantly covering these extremely controversial stories and hearing it from everyone. How I wasn't fair in this way, I wasn't fair in this way. And also at times the self-doubt about, is the work I'm doing making this any better? Is it making it worse? And is there a structural problem with how we in the media sometimes tackle this? So I want to briefly read a small passage from the chapter, and the timing is fitting, the chapter from North Charleston after the death of Walter Scott, which the jury is currently deliberating whether this officer will be convicted or will not. Now, when Walter Scott got killed, I had finally gotten out of the daily grind of this. We had launched this. We hadn't launched it yet, but we knew internally we were working on this large police database. We were going to track every fatal police shooting. We were going to figure out all these statistics on them. And we were going to do these big, comprehensive, sweeping stories to try to wrap our arms around the idea of police violence. And so, which I was really excited about. It meant I didn't have to write on every video. I didn't have to, every day it wasn't the next hashtag. We were stepping back and doing some enterprise. And so as we started working on the first story in this project that ends up being our Pulitzer Prize winning project, I get a call from a really good source of mine, this guy Ryan. Now Ryan people often think that the geniuses, if such people exist, to making these stories go big or viral, are the civil rights attorneys. In my experience, and I know all the civil rights attorneys, in my experience, there's a second set of people, Ryan being probably chief among them, who in fact are public relations professionals who work for civil rights attorneys. Ryan's job is he works the network of all the southern states, all the civil rights attorneys, and when they have a case that they can't really get the local media to pay attention to, but there's something there, he's the man who calls me, or calls Tremaine Lee, calls Michelle Cinder, calls John L. Gian. He's written every statement ever given on behalf of Trayvon Martin's family, on Michael Brown's family, and Tamir Rice's family. He is the first white person your family sees when a white cop kills your black son. And so I get a call from Ryan Jewelson this day, and he goes, look, I really like you, and I don't want to screw you, but we've already placed this story, so you can't have it. But find out everything you can about this man named Walter Scott. He was killed in North Charleston 3 days ago. This video is going to be worse than Eric Gardner, and it's going to publish in the New York Times at 7 o'clock. And so it was this rare moment of exhilaration, but also anxiety, right? One, source calls you to tell you you're about to get scooped is not a very fun. Thanks. All right, now, so you're anticipating the email I'm going to get from my editor in 4 hours. Like, what is this? But what was also strange was, these stories, these shootings, seem, I know, they pop up so organically. You're going about your Tuesday, and all of a sudden everyone is talking about this video. You're going about your Friday night and all of a sudden your Facebook feed is full of this person's name. And what was strange in this moment was sitting and looking at the not yet deactivated Facebook page of the next hashtag. Looking through his photos, knowing who he was, seeing how he had no Google News result. Literally no one knew who this human was. And I knew in 2.5 hours, this man's going to be his death is going to be streaming live on every cable channel. To abbreviate what happens next, the police immediately fire the officer once they receive the tape. And so we, in fact, ended up scooping the Times because they were stuck to this embargo for several hours later. And we needed to be paying attention to North Charleston, and so we were able to get this story out. And ended up being the first outlet that covered the fact that this officer had been fired and charged with a crime for a shooting. Now, obviously, when this video was released several hours later, that took all of the eyeballs, and rightfully so. I didn't want to go to North Charleston. I thought really strongly, let me work really hard on this first day story and make up for the fact that we almost got scooped, but ended up kind of scooping them. So I won't have to get on the plane. Maybe we'll send somebody else. I won't have to go door knock this week, because how many times can you stand in the living room of a family and ask the same questions? And so I want to read a passage briefly from that first interview with Walter Scott's mother, and kind of what some of the thoughts going through my head were as myself and several other reporters approached her that day. It was my second or third day in North Charleston, most of which had been spent interviewing demonstrators and local elected officials about the shooting and its aftermath. The speed with which local elected officials had acted in firing and charging Officer Slager had taken the wind out of some of the protest. One of several factors in South Carolina that kept demonstrations there from ever swelling to Ferguson levels. We're not going to be another Ferguson, the city officials kept repeating to any reporter who would listen, as they had since those first interviews on the first night of the story. But, just as the residents in Ferguson had forcefully alleged, the men and women who had taken to the streets in North Charleston, often in dozens as opposed to the crowds of hundreds elsewhere, said they were being over-policed. Specifically, they said, through traffic stops. That day, I'd gotten a text from Ryan Jewelson, who had traveled to North Charleston to help the family handle the media storm. He gave me the Scott family's address and told me to come over. After I'd stood outside for about half an hour, Walter Scott's mother emerged from a side door. The TV types, who had for the last 24 hours or so anchored their news vans in the parking lot outside of the North Charleston Police Department, as well as here at the family house, were preoccupied. It was just a handful of us, print reporters, myself and colleagues from the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, who spotted Mrs. Scott's reluctant presence. I glanced over at Ryan, who responded with a nod, encouraging the pack of us to slowly move forward with our notebooks and recorders to speak to this distraught mother. Now, there's no right way to approach these interviews. In the moment, you are very literally walking up to a heartbroken human, someone struggling to avoid being completely engulfed by a wave of pain and confusion, and asking them to find the words to express those feelings and thoughts. And the 24-hour news cycle doesn't help, because so often it prompts reporters to ask either cliched, soundbite bait, or process questions, to which the response of a dead man or woman's family really adds little. Do you think you can get justice? Do you think there should be a special prosecutor appointed? What do you think about those protesting? You want them to be peaceful, right? Now, all those questions are on their face fine. I've asked them all at some point or another many times. But it's hard standing across from a mother whose son has been stolen from her, or a father whose daughter will be buried next week, to justify asking about legal minutiae. Instead, at the advice of a veteran reporter I once found myself standing beside at the crime scene tape, my questions to the grieving try to center on the life lost, a memory, a caricature trait of the life lived, and not a rehashing of the details of how that life was lost. It always starts awkwardly, typically with me stammering through a preamble that's as much of an apology for the fact that I'm there than it is a question. Can you tell me about Walter? What will you remember about him? Judy Scott paused, then she sighed. Walter was 50, but he was still a mama's boy. He called her every day, his sharp, "Hey mama," flowing into her ear, usually sometime in the afternoon. And at the conclusion of each call, he'd tease her. "You know you're my Smurf, right?" Scott would say to his aging mom, with a kind and loving tone that can only be known between a mother and a son. "Love you." I don't know why, but he gave me that nickname, his Smurf, Judy Scott told us as we stood in her driveway, where for the last 47 years she'd raised her now slain son. And even now, as a man with children of his own, he spent every Sunday afternoon laid out on her couch, joking around with his siblings and cousins as she worked to prepare their after-church meal. It was a scene that played out week after week in this home for 5 decades. Next Sunday, the mother knew, something would be missing from it. Just 2 weeks earlier, Walter and his siblings had gathered the entire extended family here for a surprise party for Judy and her husband in the honor of their 50th wedding anniversary. It was a joyous evening, full of photo albums, cake, and laughs. And for Judy, it was a night full of tears, because it provided her with everything she had wanted. All of her family, grown, but together again. As Judy Scott spoke, I couldn't help but imagine my own mother, standing on the lawn in front of my family home in suburban Cleveland, being pestered with questions about me or one of my brothers. I couldn't help but think about how much Scott's family sounded like my own. The Sunday afternoon dinners after church, the all-hands-on-deck gatherings to celebrate an anniversary or a holiday. There's nothing that can prepare a family for the heart-clenching shock of losing one of their own. And time again, those left behind have described to me how so suddenly a normal, mundane weekday had become the worst days of their life. A black hole of time permanently etched in the video feed of their minds. Jump for 1 second. Judy Scott could only bear to speak with us for a few minutes, which was many more minutes than we deserved. But she did invite a handful of us into the family home, where some other loved ones might be able to give more details about Walter. As I entered, the family members paused their conversations, wondering for a moment, who was this intruder, before deciding it didn't really matter. Nothing I could take from them, be it time or information, compare to what had so freshly been stripped from their security and comfort. Seated in the kitchen, I found Anthony Scott, the slain man's brother. "Come over and have a seat," he implored me, prompting my practice shtick. Anthony told me that he and his brother had bonded like many brothers do over sports. Specifically, he told me as his sister and their nieces scurried through the room, arranging dishes and platters brought by friends and family members, that Walter loved football. The brothers would play pickup ball late into the night on the gravel street out in front of the house, a cream and green 2-story in which they'd both been raised, as evidenced by the time capsule photographs lining the walls and mantel, elementary school pictures, middle school sports team photos, and smiling sons reaching adulthood. Anthony in a cap and gown, Walter in his marine blues. As they got older, Anthony and Walter began growing families of their own, but they never missed watching a Dallas Cowboys game on a Sunday. Even if they weren't at the same television, Walter would call his brother and the two would provide each other real-time commentary until the final down, screaming into the phone in response to a big play or tackle. "Did you see that?" He would be yelling into the phone, Anthony told me, leaning back in his chair for a moment of reflection. "Man, I'm really going to miss that." The family gathered again on Wednesday night, April 8th, 2015, in the same living room to watch the national news, at times gasping and sighing as video of Scott's death flashed on their television screen. Before long, NBC flashed they had an exclusive interview with Fenandin Santana, the young man who'd taken the bystander video of Walter Scott's death. Lester Holt, one of the nation's most esteemed journalists, had flown to North Charleston for the interview, which he was conducting at that very moment on the Scott family front lawn. "Mr. Scott didn't deserve this," Santana said that day, prompting a round of applause from the Scott family, who along with me were watching the interview live from a living room just 50 feet away from where it was being taken place. As soon as it concluded, the family got up and they began putting on their coats. I turned to Ryan Julison, who had joined me in the living room to watch the interview, and I earnestly asked him where they could be possibly heading. "To finalize Walter's burial plot," he told me. So, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. How much time do we have, Jim? None.
Well, I can tell you, I would stay all night, but our crew has a couple more hours to go. Some of them have been up since 4 this morning.
Oh.
It's just a fabulous night. We're so pleased to have you. Please come back. We're going to do this again tomorrow. We're going to do our movie when it comes out for the round table here. So, again, thank you so much. Delightful.
Thank our guest sponsors again. Those who want to follow us at the after party, we'll be at 701 restaurant.
I'm trying to decide how to finish my. Can you hold this for me? I will be happy. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. I have to